Hello, this is the first video for Chapter 6 of Basic Sentential Logic and Informal Fallacies. In this video, I'm going to go through, I think, probably sections 6.1 through 6.6, so most of the fallacies, and then there will be a second video where I will finish up the fallacies and then just work through some examples, additional practice. Okay. So where are we at? The first fallacy, well, let's remind ourselves, I guess, of what this chapter is. So chapter 5 covered fallacies of relevance. And if you recall, in those cases, there was a consideration that looked like it was relevant, but it was really irrelevant. Okay, so for instance, where an argument comes from looks like it's relevant, but really it's irrelevant. It's an irrelevant consideration to whether the argument's a good argument. In this chapter, chapter 6, the topic is fallacies of weak induction, and as you can see here with the definition. The problem is that not that the key premises are irrelevant. They are relevant. The problem is that even though they're relevant, they don't really provide strong inductive support for the conclusion. They only provide weak inductive support. And here's an example, our first fallacy, which is appeal to authority. Now, as you can see from here's the definition. Fallacy is committed when the arguer cites as evidence the authority or testimony of someone who's not in fact an authority in the relevant subject area. Okay, so let's see some examples of this. By the way, before I move on to examples, let me say a little bit about this one. In many cases, appealing to an authority is legitimate if the person is an actual authority in the topic that you're discussing. So if you're having an argument with someone, about, which states were part of the Confederacy versus the Union in the Civil War, and you and your friend are disagreeing, if you go to someone who's a history expert, like a history professor, or someone who's a legitimate history buff who knows a lot, and you ask them and they tell you, oh yeah, that state X was part of the Union, that's good. That's good evidence. Okay, so often if you appeal to an authority, that's a good way to settle a dispute or to sort of provide evidence for a claim. The problem is that this general idea goes awry when people cite as evidence someone who isn't necessarily an authority. So, for example, you see this a lot in advertising. I need to buy some drinks for the party tonight. I think I'll get Diet Pepsi because that's what MC Hammer says has the best taste. Celebrity endorsements in general are appeal to authority, and somehow people have this idea that if someone's a celebrity, that somehow their opinion on things counts for more, or is sort of a window into the universal truth of the matter, or something like that. When realistically, first off, they're getting paid to say these things, but even if they weren't getting paid, right? Suppose MC Hammer actually just came out and said, hey, I like Pepsi rather than Coke, so what? He's one person. A lot of people like Coke rather than Pepsi, so there's no need to necessarily believe that his opinion should carry any special amount of weight in deciding what's the best thing to do. Another example. Brad Pitt said in a recent interview that nuclear power plants should be shut down because they're unsafe. So I'm going to vote to close them down since they are clearly unsafe. Now in this case, just like the last one, there's no reason to think that Brad Pitt knows any more about nuclear fission and safety of nuclear power plants than you or I do, right? So the fact that he says something, even though he's a celebrity, Doesn't mean that we should necessarily do what he's saying. Now, keep in mind, suppose that if in the interview Brad Pitt was saying something about starting an acting career. Okay, well, he is a very successful actor. So if the topic is something about acting advice, advice for people trying to break into the industry, or advice for people who are already in the industry to be more successful, or whatever, then it wouldn't be fallacious to appeal to his opinion on these things to settle disputes or to use as like good advice, because he is known to be an authority in those areas. So if we just go back to the definition here, notice that it's a fallacy when the person is not an authority in the subject area. If they are an authority, then that's legit. I can say a little bit more about this. I don't want to get too fine-grained, but everything I've said so far is basically what you need to know for this fallacy. We can drill down a little bit more into this and say the following. They should be an authority relative to the disputants. Okay, so for example, if two high school students are arguing about some historical fact, maybe they could go to someone, at a college who's an undergrad history major and ask them. And so relative to the high school students, the history major is an authority, let's say, because you can just expect that they probably know more than the high school students, and so is a good source for them to settle disputes. On the other hand, if you are a history graduate student, you're getting your PhD, but you don't have it yet, you're a grad student, and you're having a discussion with one of your history grad student pals about something, you wouldn't go to an undergraduate history major to settle your dispute, because you guys probably know more than the history major. So you would want to go to someone who's like, a faculty member, senior faculty member, especially one who specializes in the specific time period or event or something that your dispute concerns. So what counts as an authority can be relative to the people who are in the discussion. But in the case of Brad Pitt, there's no reason to think he's a relative authority on nuclear power compared to me or compared to my mom or anything like that. Next example. Lester Brown, author of the annual State of the World report, has said that the depletion of the rainforests is one of the 10 most serious problems worldwide. Thus, it must be the case that this is in fact a very serious problem. So this illustrates something. If you want to use an appeal to authority to help bolster your argument about something or to help make a point, first off, use someone who really is an authority. Okay. Second off, you might need to sort of provide that person's credentials as part of your argument, right? I just made this up. Lester Brown, I don't know if Lester Brown is not a real person unless it's sheer coincidence. But suppose it were a real person, and this is my argument. I wouldn't necessarily just assume that everyone I'm talking to knows who Lester Brown is. So I might have to, if I'm going to appeal to Lester Brown's authority on this topic, I might also need to sort of give this person's credentials so that people who are listening to me know that the person I'm appealing to is kind of an authority in that area. Okay? If the person doesn't give the credentials, and if it's just not kind of commonly known among the people in the discussion that someone's an authority on the topic, then it's an appeal to authority fallacy. Next up, appeal to ignorance. This is committed when an arguer claims that a lack of evidence for some claim constitutes evidence for that claim's negation. That's a little bit of a mouthful, but you can sort of see what this means. It's a move from something like, it's false that I established P, and someone's like moving from that to, I established that it's false that P. And those two things don't mean the same thing, right? So for instance, suppose I flip a coin, and then I just don't look at it, right? And suppose P is, the coin is heads, right? It might be that it's false that I established the coin as heads, right? Maybe I just haven't looked at it yet. Okay, so I haven't established one way or the other, but I have not established that the coin is heads. That doesn't mean that I have established that it's false that it's heads, right? That's not the same thing as establishing that it's tails. Okay, so you can certainly see how in some cases it's very clear that this is a bad move, right? Just not looking to see if it's heads doesn't mean that you've shown that it's tails. Okay. It's also something like there's no evidence for P, and you're moving from that to there's evidence for not P. And those are different things, right? Just because there's no evidence for P, that by itself isn't the same thing as evidence for not P. At least not all the time. We'll get to some examples where you could maybe argue either way. But in many cases it's clear. So for instance, nobody has ever proved that God does not exist. So God must exist. So you can imagine someone who's trying to establish the existence of God, and one way they might do that is they might say, well, look, throughout history, hundreds of people have tried to prove that God doesn't exist, but God doesn't exist. But these arguments have all failed. Therefore, God exists. Of course, you could, do that the other way around too, right? Someone could say no one's ever proved God does exist, so therefore God must not, right? I mean, in this case, it could work either way. And in particular, you just might think that God's the sort of thing you couldn't prove either way. If you wanted to, I mean, that's what some people think. Not everyone thinks that. Some people think they have proved that God exists, that they have proved that God can't, or whatever. But one view of the matter is that God is just such a sort of supernatural being that it would just defy proof either way, let's say. Let's look at another example. Nobody's ever proved that ESP actually happens, so it must not. Now my goal with this one is to provide an example that's a little bit more borderline. We'll get back to that, but you might look at this and think, well, gosh, maybe if no one has ever proved that ESP actually happens, maybe that is good evidence that it doesn't happen. I can see people going either way on this, but we'll get back to this one. Here's the one to really think about. So here's the setup on this third one. Suppose I'm in a small, it's like 10 foot by 10 foot room. It's completely empty. It's painted white. It's brightly lit. There's nothing in it but me and a bright light and the white walls, and that's it. And I can't find my keys. Okay? I don't know where they are. And then I say this. I say, I've looked all over this room. I can't find my keys. So they must not be here. Well, notice this has the same form as the other ones, right? I looked for my keys. I couldn't find that. I couldn't establish that my keys are here, right? That's what not finding them means, right? You tried to establish that they're there and you couldn't, and then you're taking that to entail that they aren't there. That's the same as establishing that they are not there. Now, I think in this case, this one looks legit. This looks like a good move. Now, the question is, why is it sometimes good? What is it, or what's the key that should tip you off if someone is making an argument of this form to whether it's a good argument or a fallacious argument? Or let me just frame it this way. In some cases, this move, there is no evidence for P to there is evidence for not P, right? There is no evidence for P, just is evidence for not P. When is that reasonable? Right? In the white room, no evidence that my keys are there does seem like it's evidence that they're not there. Okay. Um, when is this move reasonable? Well, here's a quick way to think about it. If it's a situation where if P were true and you looked for evidence for P, you'd expect to be able to find it. Okay, so in the case of the room that's empty with, and it's white with a bright light, that's a situation where if my keys were there and I looked for them in that situation, you'd expect I'd be able to find them. Okay? Because it's a situation like that, this move is good. Okay? But suppose you're in a situation where even if you looked for evidence, you wouldn't necessarily expect to be able to find it necessarily. Right? And a lot of situations are like that. They're such that even if you do the investigation, you wouldn't expect necessarily that people will come up with, an answer. Right? So for instance, suppose I've lost my key in my house, and my house has 20 rooms. There's a lot of them are messy. There's loads of furniture. It's not very well lit, and I can't find my keys. Well, that's a situation where even if I look for my keys, you might think, well, I'm not necessarily going to find them, right? So even if I look and I say, oh, I haven't found them in my house, I looked, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not there. They could be there, right? So the thing you need to ask yourself with the appeal to ignorance fallacies is, first off, you identify the form. You say, it's got the form of an appeal to ignorance. They're trying to make this move from no evidence for P to evidence for not P. Then ask yourself, is that a legit move? Is this a context where we'd expect there to be evidence for P if someone looked for it? Okay, so you might think the ESP example is like this. You might think, well, ESP is the sort of thing that if it were legit and we tried to establish that, we'd be able to establish it somehow. And so if in fact we haven't, then maybe that's evidence that it doesn't exist, or that it's not a legit phenomenon. Now, of course, some people think that it has been established. I don't want to get into, again, this in logic, we're not concerned about what's actually true or false. We're concerned about reasoning. And, if there's a study that you're aware of where someone actually did a legit test of ESP and it actually happened, then fine. That's, I'm not trying to prove to people that ESP isn't legit. I'm just saying that if the argument is going from no one's ever proven it to it must not be a legit phenomenon, that argument is strong. Okay? Is it cogent? Well, maybe. It depends on whether the premise is true. Is it in fact the case that nobody's ever proven ESP actually happens? But we're more concerned about whether it's strong or weak, not about whether it's cogent. Okay, let's move on to the next fallacy. Slippery slope. This one happens a lot. Actually, a lot of these happen a lot. Argument for ignorance happens a lot in political context. No one's, there's been absolutely no proof that, such and such policy has had an effect on yada yada. Well, maybe that's true. That doesn't mean that that by itself doesn't mean the policy has no effect. Just the fact that no one's been able to prove that it does have an effect. Okay, so that happens a lot in political discussions and all kinds of discussions. So does this one, slippery slope. Fallacies committed when the arguer claims that his or her position must be preferred to some rival position because the other position, the rival position, will lead to a chain of events, right? If we adopt that position, or if we accept the conclusion of the rival position, that'll be the first stage in a chain of events that leads to some undesirable consequences. It's a fallacy if in fact the chain of events isn't likely to occur. Now keep in mind the chain might be short. I'm going to give examples where the chain involves like 3 or 4 steps. It could be one or 2 steps, okay? It's just easier to see if there's a lot of steps. So let's see some examples. We should outlaw pornography. So suppose this is my position. I think we should outlaw pornography. Now I'm going to give you an argument for that. The continued manufacture of this material. So my opponent thinks we shouldn't outlaw it, that we should, that we should allow the continued production of pornography. How am I going to argue against it? Well, listen. Continued manufacture of this material will lead to an increase in crimes such as rape and incest. This will gradually erode the moral fabric of society, resulting in increased crimes of all sorts. Soon we'll be facing the complete collapse of law and order, and perhaps the end of civilization. Obviously, the last bit was sort of rhetorical flourish on my part. In a real argument, it might end here with the gradually erode the moral fabric of society. Maybe it would end here with increased crimes of all sorts. Probably wouldn't go this far, unless you're really listening to someone who's kind of over the top. But you see the form of the argument, right? My opponent's position is, no, let's keep doing, allow pornography to be produced. And I say, okay, well, you think that sounds innocent. You think, it sounds like an innocent position, whatever. But let me tell you something you don't know. Okay, what you don't realize is that if we accept my opponent's position, continue to allow pornography to be produced, that's the first step on this slippery slope, right? And once we take that first step, we're just going to slide down and keep going down until we hit bottom. There's some like really bad end game for us here. We don't want that end game, right? We don't want the collapse of civilization, or we don't want increase in crimes of all sorts, or whatever the bad result is. So the only way to avoid that is to avoid that first step, the one that looked innocent on the surface but really leads to bad things. So we have to avoid the opponent's position, which means that my position is the one to go with. Okay. Now, in any case, a lot of times this can work either way, right? In many cases, both sides can make a slippery slope argument. For example, my opponent might come back and say, attempts to outlaw pornography should be abandoned. That's my position. And what does my opponent say? Well, if pornography is outlawed, then this will open the door to censorship of newspapers and magazines. Then we will see textbooks and university curricula censored as well. Then the government will be in the business of maintaining complete mind control over us all. So you can see the same pattern here, right? My opponent is now arguing against me and saying, well, look, Rick's position, outlawing pornography, that looks like it's innocent. It looks like maybe it's a good idea, whatever. But here's what you don't realize, because you haven't thought it through. If we do that, if we accept his position, and maybe Rick hasn't realized it either because he hasn't thought it through. If we accept that first position, then look what's going to happen. Then next there's going to be this other more extreme thing, and then another thing, and another thing, and then eventually it's this clearly horrible end result. The only way to avoid that is to not take that first step. Don't outlaw pornography. Now, a couple of things to say about this. First off, just because something has the form of a slippery slope doesn't mean it's fallacious. You have to ask yourself, well, does that seem like it's maybe is a possible chain of events that might occur, right? So, for example, we should pay to have the hole in the dam fixed immediately. If we do not, then the water levels will continue to rise, overflowing the banks of the river. Eventually, the entire valley will be flooded, and the town will be underwater. Surely we can't allow this to happen. So you can see this has the same form of a slippery slope, right? I'm trying to argue against a position, right? The position says, oh, let's not raise taxes to fix this hole in the dam. It's a small hole. Let's not worry about it. I'm saying, no, we should reject that. We should have taxes, and we should fix the hole. Why? Well, if we don't, if we go with what my opponent says, here's a sequence of events that could occur. And if it's a sequence of events that might in fact occur, then that it's not a fallacy, right? So you have to sort of reflect a little bit on what sorts of things you think might happen. In many cases, in political discussions and other kinds of discussions, people will present a slippery slope such that if you step back a little bit and think, if you're not paranoid, you will realize that the thing they're appealing to may not happen, probably won't happen. Okay, that if you're a little bit paranoid, maybe you would think something like that would occur, but if you're kind of not over the top, you wouldn't. Now, going back to these two cases, right? How can you tell? You might say, hey, Rick, that's great. I understand the fallacy. I understand, the situations in which it would be fallacious and cases in which it wouldn't. But, how do I know? I'm just a student here trying to, get through life. Throw me a bone. Well, how can you tell? Well, sometimes you may not. Sometimes you may not be able to tell. Sometimes you just have to kind of go with your common sense. People's common senses might differ, right? You might think that this chain of events is a legit danger, and your roommate might not think it's a legit danger. Does that mean that you're just stuck at that point? Not necessarily. You could try to collect data. In this sort of case, the data might be hard to collect. You can't really do a controlled experiment, but you can say, you could look back or look at other societies that have tried this, either had pornography, and see if in fact that leads to increased crime and collapse of society, or cultures or countries where they've outlawed pornography, and see if in fact that has led to increased censorship and overly onerous government control. So you could sort of collect data. Maybe it's historical data, or depending on the context, it might be data of other sorts. So that would be a way that you might be able to adjudicate whether or not a chain of events is likely. This is an old one. FDA still against medical pot. Not so much anymore. This is changing. This is an old one. Despite mounting evidence to support it, the FDA has reaffirmed its stance against the use of medical marijuana. What do you think? K. Holmes says, this is the slippery slope, man. First they outlaw medical marijuana, and the next thing you know, it's only a matter of time before they make all pot illegal. It's a joke, by the way. This is from The Onion, obviously. But it's a joking, comedic implementation of slippery slope fallacy for you. Okay, next up. False dichotomy. This fallacy, the fallacy of false dichotomy, is committed when arguer claims that his conclusion is one of only two options, and that's an important part, that there's a specific number of options. Usually it's two. And the problem is there's more than two. And like I said, usually it's two, but really there's more than two. It could be that maybe in some cases it might be, well, there's three options, but really there's 4 or 5. The key is that there's more options than I'm saying there are. But it's easiest to make the case when I'm saying there's two, when in fact there are other possibilities. The arguer goes on to show that the only other option is false or outrageous or dangerous, and so my option, the preferred option, has to be embraced. Okay, so for example, suppose that you've got a teenager arguing with their parent over something, and the teenager says, either you let me go to Coachella or I'll be miserable for the rest of my life. I know you don't want me to be miserable, so you should let me go. So the way this argument works is presenting two positions, right? Either go to Coachella or I'm miserable for the rest of my life. And clearly the miserable for the rest of my life option isn't good. Even you, my disagreeable parent, you're not that cruel to want that, so you should let me go. When really there's other options available. Those aren't the only two, right? Maybe the kid doesn't go to Coachella and they're upset for a few days, and then the rest of their life is fine. But you sort of see how the argument works. it's a false dichotomy, but the argument hinges on presenting the situation as though there's only these options, and one of them is just clearly outrageous, so you have to prefer my position. A lot of advertising hinges on this. Either you use Speed Stick deodorant or you will stink to high heaven. You don't want to stink, so you better buy Speed Stick. They're usually not this blunt about how, the sort of gist of their advertising, but this is, what's sort of under the hood, so to speak, of a lot of marketing campaigns is kind of a false dichotomy between your purchasing of their product and some kind of really bad end game. Now, one thing to point out is that, let me just go back here. It's a disjunctive syllogism, right? So the argument is, well, either P or Q. There's only two options, P or Q. Not P, right? P is false or P is bad. We want to avoid P. So Q is the only thing left. Okay. Now, given that, you might think, well, you can only have a false dichotomy if someone is expressing first a disjunction, either P or Q. Either you let me do this or I'll be miserable. Either you buy Speed Stick or you'll stink. But remember from your chapter 4 days that disjunctions can be re-expressed as conditionals. Okay? So you use Speed Stick or you stink means the same thing. You could re-express this as, if you don't use Speed Stick, then you stink. Okay? So sometimes things can be expressed as a conditional, but it's still a false dichotomy, because of course this conditional only works if the only options are using Speed Stick or stinking. Right? Suppose there's a third option. Suppose that really a true disjunction would be either you use Speed Stick or you stink, or you use deodorant brand X. Right? There's another brand of deodorant which you could use, and you wouldn't stink and you wouldn't be using Speed Stick. So there's a third option. Well, if that's true, then this conditional doesn't hold, right? It's no longer the case that if you don't use Speed Stick, you'll stink. Why? Because maybe you're using brand X deodorant. So sometimes things can be expressed as a conditional, but it's still a false dichotomy. What it's saying is that the only other option, right, if you don't do this one, then you're stuck with that. Okay. Here's another example. This one's from real life. I lived in Denmark for a year back in the late 90s. And my Danish girlfriend, the Danes smoke they smoke a lot. It kind of surprised me. I didn't think they would, but man, they are smokers there. And she knew I wasn't a fan of the smoking. But I wasn't like pushing her on it too much, but a little bit. And this was an argument she gave me once. Well, either I keep smoking or I'll get fat. I don't want to get fat, so I better keep smoking. I'm condensing, a larger discussion here. But there's a number of things to say about this. First off, as I told her at the time, I said, well, look, so what if you gain a few pounds? Who cares, right? Yeah, obviously. But let's not worry about that for purposes of this fallacy. Let's just suppose that for whatever reason that's important to you. Okay? It's still a false dichotomy, right? Because still, even if it's important to you to sort of keep your weight right where it's at, you could quit smoking and still keep where it's at. Maybe you just exercise a little bit more, which is also good for your health in addition to stopping smoking, or whatever. So you can see it's still a false dichotomy. There are other, sort of realistic options open to you besides those two. Even if you've already decided that you want to keep your weight where it's at, and gaining a few pounds is like a big deal to you for some reason. Okay. Let's consider this one. Either we keep Charles Manson in prison or we release him, thus risking murder, carnage, and mayhem. We don't want murder, carnage, or mayhem, so we'd better keep him in prison. Excuse me. Okay. Now, you may not know a lot about Charles Manson. This was a while ago, but this guy is nuts. This is an actual dude. I didn't just make up Charles Manson for purposes of illustration of an informal fallacy. He's an actual guy who is a serious psychopath. He carved a swastika into his own forehead. He's like went on a serial killing spree, I think in the 70s or something like that. And if you've ever seen interviews with this dude, he is clearly, you do not want him anywhere near you in real life. Now, this has the form of a dichotomy. Either we keep him in prison or we're risking a lot of danger, public danger. And you might think, oh, hey, this is a false dichotomy argument because there's more options, right? We could release him, but just, have a SWAT team around him 24/7 or, whatever. The question, though, when you're assessing whether something is a false dichotomy is, what are the realistic options open to you? Okay. There could be cases where, and I think this is an example, where realistically, suppose you're on the parole board, the options open to you are, well, we let him go, in which case we're putting people at risk. Murder, carnage, and mayhem are legit risks. Or we keep him in prison. Yeah, there are other possibilities, right? You could, put him in a rocket and send him to the moon or whatever. But those are like outlandish, impractical possibilities that you can't really implement. The key to whether something's a false dichotomy is, what are the realistic options open to you? And if realistically there's just two options open to you, then this, as is the case here, it's not a fallacy. Now, if we go back to this one, there are two options presented, but really there's more, and there's not just more in some sort of like outlandish logical sense. There's more realistic options. It's very realistic for people to exercise a little bit more or something like that to keep their weight at its current level, that sort of thing. So that's the key when you're assessing false dichotomies, is the realistic options that are open to you. Okay, now if you've been paying attention, which of course you have, then you might have the following question, or something might have occurred to you. You might think something like, gosh, I'm not sure I can distinguish slippery slope from false dichotomy. They sort of seem really similar to me. Can you help me out in distinguishing them? Yes, I can. Here's why they seem similar. They seem similar because they both essentially have the form of a disjunctive syllogism. Okay? Keep in mind, disjunctive syllogism is a legit, valid form of inference. So slippery slope has this form, A or B, not B, therefore A. So it's my position or my opponent's. I argue against my opponent's position with this sort of chain of events. If we adopt my opponent's position, it'll lead to this chain of events with a bad consequence. That's how I argue against my opponent's position. Therefore, my position. I'll get back to the chain of events in a second. False dichotomy has exactly the same form. There's two options. Better not go with the other option, option B, my opponent, right? That's bad or it's false. Therefore, my option is preferred. Now, you might think that the difference is this, that what makes something slippery slope is that you're establishing premise 2, you're establishing the falsity of the other position with a chain of events like this, right? So I want to keep pornography legal. B is my opponent wants to outlaw it. I'm going to go to we shouldn't outlaw it. Why? Because if we outlaw it, then there will be censorship. If there's censorship, then the government's going to be, mind controlling us all. We don't want that. We don't want government mind control. Therefore, by modus tollens, not D gives us not C gives us not B, right? So we can get not B from this chain of reasoning. And you might think, that's what makes it slippery slope. It's that we used a chain of reasoning here to establish this premise. No, you would be wrong if you thought that. Why? Well, because you could do the same thing with false dichotomy. Okay. There's nothing in the definition of false dichotomy that talks about how I argue against the other position that I'm trying to argue against. In the examples, it was just a one-step or some kind of non-chain argument, but it could be a chain of things, right? So suppose that in the smoking case, right, it was, well, either I smoke or I'll put on some weight. If I put on weight, then my risk of diabetes will go up. If my risk of diabetes goes up, then I could suffer these health consequences. I don't want health consequences, therefore I shouldn't quit smoking. Okay, that would still be false dichotomy. So what is the difference? If it's not the chain of events here, if you could have that also with a false dichotomy, possibly, what is the difference? Well, here's the difference. The difference is where the problem is. Okay? With slippery slope, the problem is that premise 2 hasn't been established because there's a problem somewhere in this. This chain of events isn't likely. It's not a solid chain. There's a problem here. B maybe won't necessarily lead to C, which won't necessarily lead to D, or something like that. With false dichotomy, the problem is this premise. Okay? The first premise that says these are the only two options. Okay? Or let me put it another way. With an argument that's purely committing slippery slope, premise 1 is true, right? These maybe they are the only two options, A and B. The problem is how I argued against B. There was a bad argument against B that involved this chain. Okay? Premise 1 was fine. There really are the only two options. Not B, that's the one that wasn't really established, or was established in this sort of weak way. With false dichotomy, this is false. A or B is not true. There's maybe a C or a D or something, or X or Y. That's another option. The argument against B might be legit. Okay? The problem is that it doesn't matter that my argument against B is fine. I still haven't established A because there might be a C. Maybe A and B are both false. There's a C out there as Y is the truth of the matter. So this is really the way to understand the difference between the two. With slippery slope, the dichotomy might be real. The problem is how I argued against the other position. With false dichotomy, my argument against that position, that might be fine. The problem is that the dichotomy isn't real. There's really a third or fourth or more options. Okay? Now, of course, you could have arguments that commit both problems, right? So you could easily imagine a case where both premises are false. For example, imagine the smoking argument. Well, either I keep smoking or I put on weight, which is a false dichotomy, right? As we've already established, there's other options like exercise more. And I don't want to put on weight. Why? Well, because if I put on some weight, then I'll get heart disease. If I get heart disease, I'll die, and my niece won't have a role model. If my niece doesn't have a role model growing up, then she'll turn out to be a crack whore. So you could imagine someone not only having a false dichotomy here, but also having a bad argument against B that involved a bad chain. And that commit both fallacies. Okay. But now that you understand what makes each fallacy a fallacy, you'll be able to recognize, hopefully, oh, this one's slippery slope, or that argument is committing false dichotomy, or oh, this argument is actually committing both a slippery slope fallacy and a false dichotomy fallacy, or something like that. One last thing, and then I'll be done with this video. I also mentioned when I first talked about slippery slope that sometimes it's usually presented, or I'm sorry, with false dichotomy rather, it's usually presented as there's two options, I'm arguing against the one other option, therefore mine. The problem is that there's more than two options. And I said usually I say there's two, but it could also be with more. Okay, I could commit what's really a false dichotomy fallacy even if I say something like this. Well, there's only three options. There's my position, there's Smith's and Jones' positions. And then I argue against Smith's position, I argue against Jones' position, and I say, well, therefore it must be mine. Where really there's a fourth option, or a fifth, okay? And I haven't argued against those. So you could still commit the same error of just not recognizing all the possibilities, even if I think there's two others, but there's really three. Or I say, well, there's five options, but there's really six. As long as there's really more options than I'm saying that there are, and my argument depends on that fact, then I could be committing a false dichotomy fallacy. Okay, that's it for this video, and good luck with that, and next up will be the remainder of Chapter 6.